Welcome to Tales by Tochi. These stories are real, unique and exceptional because they are from personal experiences around the African culture. Don't forget to like, subscribe and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me, and also you will be able to enjoy and learn from these amazing stories. Now let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. The sun rose gently over the rusty rooftops of Ajigunle, casting a golden hue across the narrow streets where hope and hardship coexisted. Inside a modest two-room apartment with peeling paint and a noisy ceiling fan, Chuka sat hunched over his small laptop, eyes sunken from sleepless nights. His fingers moved swiftly across the keyboard, typing lines of code he hoped would one day change his life. On a rickety table beside him sat a half-empty cup of Gary and groundnut, his breakfast, lunch and often dinner. Adaora moved quietly in the background, tying her headscarf as she prepared to leave for her roadside aqua business. She paused by the door, watching her husband with tired but proud eyes. "Don't forget to rest small today," she said softly. Chuka looked up, smiled faintly and nodded. Rest wasn't in his vocabulary these days. He was building something even if the world couldn't see it yet. It wasn't just ambition that drove him, it was her. Adaora had been his biggest supporter since university, selling food from her mother's kitchen to help him buy his first computer. Her sacrifices were woven into the very foundation of his dreams. Their love story was not one made for fairy tales, but it was real and rooted in loyalty. When Chuka's parents died in a car crash during his final year, Adaora became his only family. She was there when he lost his first job after NYSC, there when he tried and failed to pitch his first app to investors. There when his laptop was stolen and they had to sell their only TV to get a second-hand one. They survived on street food and shared one mattress on a cement floor. But in all the hardship they found joy. They celebrated small wins, a completed project, a new client, a payment alert that didn't bounce. Adaora would dance around the room in her wrapper, laughing with her gap-toothed smile, and Chuka would watch her with the kind of love that couldn't be bought or faked. She was his everything. They prayed together every morning, dreaming of the day they would leave the trenches behind. And slowly things began to change. Chuka's mobile payment app gained traction in local markets. Word spread, downloads increased, and eventually, a Lagos-based angel investor took notice. He got his first serious funding, and just like that, their lives began to shift. As the money came, so did the changes. It started with little things. Upgrading their apartment, getting a new mattress, ordering food instead of cooking it. Then came a car, a new phone, designer shirts. Adaora was proud of him. She supported every step, even when she didn't understand the business lingo he now spoke with his new friends. But as Chuka climbed higher, he began to drift. Business meetings ran late into the night. He traveled often, attended flashy events, and surrounded himself with people who spoke with polished accents and laughed at his old Ajigunle slang. Adaora found herself sitting alone in their new Lekki apartment, scrolling through Instagram photos of her husband in suits beside models and celebrities. She didn't complain. She simply asked, "How was your day?" and smiled, trying to hold on to the man she once knew. But she could feel the distance growing. There were no more shared Gary cups. No more dancing in wrappers. Just silence and the sound of success, echoing through marble floors that now felt colder than their old cement walls. Chuka's success grew like wildfire. What started as a simple payment app for small businesses quickly became a staple in marketplaces across Nigeria. His name began to circulate in tech circles. Journalists reached out for interviews, tech blogs featured him, and before long venture capitalists came knocking. With each new investment, his influence expanded, and so did his ego. Adaora watched from the sidelines, still cooking his meals, still folding his clothes, but no longer standing beside him at public functions. She'd always been shy about crowds, but this felt different. Chuka no longer invited her. "They won't understand your vibe," he'd said once, chuckling as if her humility embarrassed him. He'd grown into someone she barely recognized, handsome in tailored suits, speaking with a polished accent that seemed to erase Ajigunle from his tongue. He hired stylists, personal assistants, and a PR manager, and Adaora, the woman who once edited his CVs and scrubbed his shoes, found herself forgotten in his shadow. It wasn't that he no longer cared, at least not in a way he could admit to himself. Chuka had simply convinced himself that this new version of life required new rules, new people, new environments. Adaora still loved him, and he believed he still loved her, but not in the way he once did. Now she was part of his past, his struggle story. He would mention her in speeches, always with words like supportive, strong, and held me down, but the warmth was gone. At parties and networking events, his eyes wandered toward curvy socialites and Instagram influencers who wore confidence like perfume. He started going out more, first for business dinners, then for after parties he never mentioned. Adeora stayed home, holding on to the remnants of the man she married, praying that this phase would pass. She even tried dressing differently, bolder colors, tighter dresses, but Chuka hardly noticed. The love that once sparked in his eyes when he looked at her had faded into the same dull glaze he gave his staff. The turning point came during a celebratory gala organized by one of his major investors. It was a black tie event with champagne flowing like water and celebrities lining the red carpet. Adeora wasn't invited. Chuka claimed it was strictly business, and she stayed home watching highlights on TV. Her heart sank when the camera zoomed in on Chuka laughing with a voluptuous woman in a wine-red dress that hugged every curve. They looked too close, too familiar. The woman's fingers brushed his shoulder. He didn't flinch. Adeora stared at the screen, feeling the sting of betrayal without confirmation. That night, she cried silently, not out of jealousy, but because she realized she was becoming a stranger to the man she once held through sleepless nights. She knew something was changing, and it wasn't just him. It was them. And in that quiet realization, she sensed the first crack in their once indestructible bond. It was supposed to be a night of casual drinks and business celebration at a high-end bar in Victoria Island. Chuka arrived in a navy blue blazer and gold wristwatch that sparkled under the dim lights. The music was soft, the scent of cigars and expensive perfume filled the air. He was laughing with two investors when she walked in, Samantha. Her entrance was impossible to ignore. She wore a silk black gown with a slit that kissed her thigh and a neckline that made every man turn twice. Her hips swayed like she owned the room, and her eyes locked onto Chuka's almost instantly. She walked up to the bar, ordered a drink, and glanced over her shoulder with a smirk that could melt steel. Chuka, intrigued and mildly intoxicated by the ambience, excused himself and walked up to her. "You're not from around here, are you?" he asked, using his smoothest voice. Samantha smiled and replied, "Maybe I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." From that moment Chuka was hooked. They talked for hours. She told him she was an interior designer with expensive taste, but no one at the bar really cared about credentials. It was all about presence, seduction, mystery. Samantha was flirtatious, confident, and very aware of the effect her body had on men. Chuka, despite having a wife at home, allowed himself to indulge in the thrill. There was no wedding ring on his finger. He had stopped wearing it weeks ago. "My marriage is complicated," he lied, sipping his whiskey. Samantha didn't probe. She wasn't looking for commitment. She was looking for comfort, luxury, and access. And Chuka? He was her golden key. That night, he took her back to a hotel, not their home, not the house he shared with Adeora, but a place where guilt was dimmed by dim lights and silk sheets. What began as a casual moment, quickly spiraled into an affair that consumed him. He found excuses to see her every other night, even bought her a car within 2 weeks. Samantha knew how to play the game. She gave Chuka just enough emotional warmth to keep him addicted, while gradually hinting at her needs: bags, vacations, rent for her studio, spa treatments. Chuka, blinded by her curves and charm, complied without hesitation. He told himself it was just an escape, a reward for years of hard work. But as the weeks turned into months, Samantha grew bolder, pushing the boundaries of her influence. She started calling him during business meetings, demanding time and attention like a woman with official claims. Chuka began to feel pressure, not from her but from the growing imbalance in his life. He was juggling 2 worlds, one of loyalty and history with Adeora, and another of lust and excitement with Samantha. He knew he was on a dangerous path, but he didn't care. In his mind, he had earned the right to be reckless. What he didn't realize was that every decision he made was bringing him closer to the edge of a cliff he wouldn't see until it was too late. Adeora noticed the emotional distance long before the physical one became obvious. The home they once built together now echoed with silence. Chuka no longer kissed her goodbye or asked how her day was. He'd come home late, sometimes not at all, always with vague excuses and a distracted look. The passion had evaporated, leaving behind awkward small talk and cold dinners. Adeora tried to bridge the gap. She cooked his favorite meals, sent him messages during the day, even suggested a weekend getaway, but Chuka declined each attempt with polite indifference. The mansion felt bigger now, not because of its size, but because of the emotional vacuum it carried. She would sit on the edge of their designer couch, staring at the front door, waiting for a husband who returned in body but not in soul. Sometimes she cried herself to sleep, pressing her face into the pillow so the house help wouldn't hear her sobs echoing through the marble walls. Then came the moment she feared but didn't expect so soon: divorce. Chuka presented the papers like a business contract, his tone devoid of remorse. "I've changed, Edaora," he said simply, like her years of sacrifice could be brushed aside with a single sentence. He didn't accuse her of anything. He just said he needed something different, something more in tune with who he was becoming. She sat there, stunned, unable to process the words. All she could see were the nights she stayed up with him during coding marathons, the days she sold Accra to buy fuel for his generator, the birthdays she spent alone because he was chasing meetings. And now this? A cold dismissal? Edaora signed the papers without a fight, not because she agreed, but because she had too much pride to beg a man who had clearly moved on. She packed her bags, left the mansion, and returned to a small apartment in Surulere with nothing but her dignity. The weeks that followed were a blur. Chuka married Samantha in a private beach wedding with only select guests. Edaora watched the photos spread across social media. Samantha in a white, body-hugging gown, Chuka in white and gold bata, smiling like he had never known heartbreak. There was no trace of the man who once wrote Edaora love letters on paper scraps. That version of Chuka was gone, buried beneath pride, money, and lust. And yet, deep within her pain, Edaora felt a strange peace. She had lost a husband, yes, but perhaps she had also been freed from a man who no longer knew how to value gold because he was blinded by glitter. She wiped her tears, rolled up her sleeves, and returned to the street corner where she once sold Accra, ready to rebuild not just her life but her soul. The papers were signed, the vows broken, and the home that once rang with shared laughter now echoed with emptiness. Edaora sat in the small apartment she had moved into in Surulere, holding the final divorce document in her hands. The ink was dry, the law was satisfied, but her heart still bled. She reread the line that hit the hardest: irreconcilable differences. What did that even mean? Was it irreconcilable for a woman to stand by her man when he had nothing? Was it irreconcilable to love too deeply, to sacrifice too much, to dream with someone from the ground up? In Chuka's new world maybe it was. Edaora couldn't stop the flood of memories that came with each passing hour. Their first meal in a single-room apartment, their wedding under a rented canopy, the day she ran barefoot in the rain just to deliver a flash drive he had forgotten at home. She had given everything. And now she had nothing. Meanwhile, Chuka was high on the euphoria of his new life. Samantha had moved into the mansion with designer bags and diamond bracelets before the ink on the divorce was fully dry. The staff, once accustomed to Edaora's soft-spoken kindness, now tiptoed around Samantha's fiery moods and impossible demands. Chuka didn't care. He was too infatuated with the way she strutted across the living room in heels, how she called him baby, in a voice laced with seduction. He began dressing differently, adopting her taste: flashy suits, branded sunglasses, imported colognes. The man who once coded through the night in boxers now spent mornings choosing what wristwatch matched his outfit. Samantha insisted on redecorating the house. "This place is too boring," she said. "We need luxury, baby. We're not poor." Chuka nodded, approving expenses without question, too blinded by her curves and kisses to see the storm forming behind her beauty. Edaora didn't try to reach out. She didn't beg, didn't ask for a second chance. Her silence was her protest, her healing process. Instead, she channeled her pain into rebuilding her Accra business. Word had spread quickly in the neighborhood. The CEO's wife had been dumped for a slay queen, but Edaora walked tall, even when her voice trembled. She found strength in the women who cheered her on, in the old customers who hugged her without words. The pain didn't fade, but it changed shape. It turned into fuel. Every Accra ball she fried was a declaration that she wasn't finished. Not yet. She prayed at dawn, wiped her tears, and whispered to herself, "He will remember me." And deep down she knew he would, because no matter how high he rose, he would one day look down and realize the only woman who truly loved him was the one he left in the dust. Samantha wasted no time assuming control of Chuka's world. Barely 2 weeks into their marriage, she fired the interior designer who had worked with Edaora and brought in her own team, expensive, flashy, and excessive. The living room was transformed into a gold and white spectacle that looked more like a hotel lobby than a home. Chandeliers were imported from Dubai, a walk-in closet was installed just for her handbags, and a private masseuse was hired on retainer. "We're building an empire," she would say, sipping champagne in a silk robe while Chuka's PA waited for instructions. And Chuka, hungry to keep her satisfied, agreed to every request, signing off on massive personal and company expenses like they were chits at a game. Samantha also began demanding access to his company's product samples, using them as personal giveaways to influencers who promised to boost the brand. What Chuka didn't realize was that she saw his company not as a legacy, but as a playground. Their honeymoon phase was all over social media. Samantha documented everything: unboxings, spa days, yacht rides, designer shopping in Paris. CEO's wife goals, one post read, garnering over 50,000 likes. Chuka's followers, intoxicated by the glamour, flooded the comments with fire emojis and congratulations. But behind the scenes, his company's financial team was panicking. Budgets were bleeding. The head of finance sent repeated emails warning of overexpenditure, unnecessary PR gifts, and declining investor confidence. Samantha, who had charmed her way into every decision-making room, dismissed their concerns. "You people are just too local," she said during a staff meeting. "If you want to win big, you have to spend big." Chuka, sitting beside her, chuckled nervously, unsure how to challenge her in front of others. She had a hold on him he didn't fully understand. Every time he tried to set boundaries, she would switch tactics: tears, seduction, or subtle threats about leaving. It wasn't long before employees began resigning. The workplace culture had become toxic, with Samantha treating staff like personal servants. She would call marketing interns to deliver food to her nail salon or instruct the logistics manager to pick her up from hair appointments. The line between personal life and company responsibilities blurred, and Chuka stood in the middle, powerless. Investors began to pull out. Contracts were lost. Orders were delayed because product samples were missing, used up as PR packages to Samantha's socialite friends. But Chuka, unwilling to admit he had made a mistake, kept defending her. "She's just trying to help," he'd say. He ignored the murmurs, the growing whispers among partners, the concerned calls from mentors. In his mind, as long as Samantha was happy, the empire could be fixed. What he didn't see was that the woman he had chosen to build a future with was not laying bricks. She was tearing down the foundation, one luxury purchase at a time. The warnings came like soft knocks on a heavy door, gentle at first, then louder, then urgent. Chuka's longtime business advisor, Mr. Balagan, requested a private meeting. They met at a quiet restaurant in Ikoyi, far from the cameras and flashing lights. "Chuka," the old man said, his voice heavy with concern, "you're not paying attention." He laid out spreadsheets, highlighted financial red flags, showed evidence of misused funds, and pointed out the clear correlation between Samantha's lifestyle and the company's nosedive. Chuka rubbed his temples, sighed, then leaned back with the casual arrogance of a man too far gone. "You people don't understand this generation," he said, waving off the charts. "We're rebranding. This is marketing." Mr. Balagan's eyes narrowed. "This is madness, son. You're burning the house you worked so hard to build." But Chuka wasn't listening. His mind was too clouded with ego and lust, too scared to confront the truth. He left that meeting feeling attacked instead of advised. Other warnings followed. His lead developer resigned, citing a toxic culture. A loyal supplier threatened to pull out over unpaid invoices. Staff began to whisper about unpaid salaries and bounced expense reimbursements. Even his younger brother, who had once looked up to him like a god, confronted him during a family gathering. "Brothers, this babe go ruin you," he said bluntly. "Everybody day talk, now only you day blind." Chuka laughed it off, called him jealous, and didn't speak to him for weeks. Samantha, on her part, continued living like a queen. She was now pushing for a fashion line, claiming she wanted to build her own brand. She requested another 50 million Nigerian nairas from the company's branding budget. Chuka approved it. Not because he believed in the idea, but because saying no had become too difficult. Samantha had mastered the art of manipulation, and Chuka, already drowning, kept reaching for her hand, unaware she was the weight dragging him deeper. The final straw came when an email from one of the company's biggest investors leaked online. It was blunt, critical, and damning. "We cannot continue to align with a brand that has lost focus, credibility, and leadership integrity." The email went viral. Chuka trended on Twitter, not as a tech genius but as a cautionary tale. Hashtags like #SeoinLove, #From Adoora to Disaster, and #When Lust Leads began to circulate. Meme pages feasted on the scandal, using old photos of Adoora and rappers beside screenshots of Samantha on jets. Chuka locked himself in his office that night, staring at the mess he'd created. His phone buzzed with calls from lawyers, former partners, and press outlets. But the call that never came, the one he secretly hoped for, was Adoora's. And in that silence, he began to feel the weight of everything he had lost. Chuka sat in the boardroom of his once flourishing tech company, watching the faces of his executive team shift uncomfortably as the numbers were displayed on the projector screen. The quarterly losses were staggering. The once thriving company had sunk into debt faster than anyone could have anticipated. Their revenue had dipped by over 60% in just 5 months, and overhead costs had tripled. Most of the marketing budget had been funneled into Samantha's extravagant PR campaigns and fashion prototypes that yielded no returns. The company's reserve funds had been drained by personal expenses disguised as business transactions. First-class flights, luxury hotels, celebrity endorsements that didn't deliver. The investors had pulled out. Loan repayments were overdue. Chuka sat at the head of the table, suit crisp but his eyes hollow. He wanted to speak, to salvage the moment, but no words came. His lips moved slightly, but even his voice seemed to have abandoned him. After the meeting, Chuka returned home to find Samantha lounging in their marble bathtub, a glass of wine in one hand and her phone in the other. "Babe, I need your signature," she said lazily, not even glancing up. "The interior designer said I can't go ahead with the rooftop lounge without your approval." Chuka stood silently in the doorway, his chest tight. "Samantha, we're losing money. We can't keep spending like this," he said finally. She laughed. "Relax, it's all part of the plan. You know how long it takes for brands to blow. This is how success works, baby, you spend first, reap later." But Chuka wasn't convinced anymore. For the first time, her words sounded hollow, rehearsed, like echoes of a script meant to keep him spellbound. He turned away without signing the paper. That night, he lay awake staring at the ceiling, the whispers of regret crawling through his thoughts like shadows. The next week brought more disasters. A major client canceled their contract after complaints of delayed product delivery and poor customer service. One of their warehouses was locked by creditors due to unpaid rent. Staff strikes erupted after salaries were delayed for the 3rd time in 2 months. It was chaos. Chuka tried to reach out to former investors, only to be met with polite rejections or silence. His once dependable staff members refused to work overtime, morale was at rock bottom, and competitors were poaching their clients. In desperation, Chuka called a press conference, trying to present a calm front and reassure stakeholders, but the media was ruthless. They questioned everything, from his company's sudden financial downfall to Samantha's involvement in executive decisions. That night, alone in his study, Chuka finally opened his laptop and stared at the company's bank account. What he saw made his throat tighten. Just 1.3 million Nigerian nairas remained in the operational fund. Barely enough to cover a week's expenses. He leaned back slowly, and for the first time in his life, tears rolled down his cheeks, not for the money, but for the woman he had once discarded like she was a chapter he had outgrown. The office that once buzzed with energy was now filled with ghostly silence. Desks were empty, phones stopped ringing, and laughter had long disappeared from the hallways. Chuka walked past the glass doors of his now half-empty building, nodding absently at the few remaining staff members who avoided eye contact. Rumors had already begun circulating, whispers of bankruptcy, court orders, and asset seizures. Chuka was now a shadow of the CEO who had graced magazine covers and delivered TED Talks. He had aged dramatically in a matter of weeks. His once vibrant eyes were now dark with worry, his posture heavy with shame. Government tax agencies had launched investigations into financial mismanagement, and creditors were relentless. The luxury cars were impounded. His high-rise office in Victoria Island was closed indefinitely. The empire had fallen, and it hadn't taken long at all. Samantha, who had been distant since the money started drying up, now barely stayed at home. She claimed to be working on her fashion brand, but Chuka knew better. The signs were obvious. She'd stopped wearing her wedding ring, stopped calling him baby. Her texts became short, sometimes unread. Her laughter, once intoxicating, had turned into an annoyance, echoing from her phone as she FaceTimed strangers. One night, Chuka confronted her. "Do you still want this marriage?" he asked, voice low, tired. She scoffed, crossing her arms. "This marriage was built on money. You knew that. You're just mad the money's gone." The words hit him like a slap. "So, it was never about me?" he asked, barely believing what he was hearing. "It was about the lifestyle," she replied coldly. "The jets, the cameras, the restaurants. Not this broke man drama." She picked up her bag and walked out the door. That was the last time he saw her. She didn't even pack all her things. She left behind a closet full of designer dresses and shoes, but Chuka knew she was never coming back. A week later, he received an email from her lawyer. "This is to formally inform you that my client, Mrs. Samantha Uche Okoye, is filing for divorce based on irreconcilable differences." The irony nearly choked him. Those same words he had used to push Edaora away had now come back to haunt him. He sat alone in the mansion, the silence so loud it hurt. The electricity had been cut, bills unpaid. He sat in the dark, staring at his phone, scrolling through old photos of Edaora. Her smile. Her eyes. Her warmth. His hands trembled as he clicked on one video. It was her, laughing and playfully covering the camera while he tried to film her. "Stop, Jor, you and this you're coding," she said, smiling. He dropped the phone and buried his face in his palms. The empire was gone. But worse than that, he had lost the only woman who truly believed in his dream before the world even noticed it. The mansion, once a symbol of success, now stood as a reminder of everything Chuka had lost. Its marble floors, gold-plated furniture, and expensive art pieces mocked him in silence. It was too big for one man. Too cold. The echo of his own footsteps haunted him. One by one the house staff resigned. First the chef, then the cleaner, then the driver. The fuel in the generator ran out, and he didn't have the money to refill it. The nights were dark and filled with mosquitoes and memories. He lit candles and stared at the flames like they held answers. The fridge was empty. He had to sell his phone to buy food. He stopped picking calls from old friends, knowing all they had now was pity or gossip. The world moved on as it always does, but Chuka remained trapped in the ruins of his choices. No one came to check on him, not friends, not family, not Samantha. She had blocked him on all platforms. The only people who still contacted him were debt collectors and legal officers. Chuka, who once had 5 personal assistants, now walked on foot to the nearest cybercafe to check his emails. His clothes, once hand-tailored by stylists, were now washed by hand and dried on balcony rails. Some neighbors began to recognize him. The former CEO now reduced to a tenant on the verge of eviction. A few whispered. Some pointed. But no one offered help. He felt invisible. One night, as he sat outside under the stars with only a piece of bread for dinner, he thought about ending it all. Jumping into the lagoon. Just disappearing. But something in him held on. Not strength, not pride, just a tiny flicker of something unnamed. Regret maybe. Or hope. He started to think about Edaora more often. Not just what he had done to her, but who she had been to him. Her laughter. Her faith. The way she believed in his dream when it was still just an idea scribbled in his notebook. He wanted to call her, to say sorry, but he didn't even know where to find her. She had changed her number, disappeared from social media. He tried searching through mutual friends, but no one would help him. He had burnt too many bridges. So one day he walked. From Lekki to Surulere. Searching. Asking. Hoping someone would mention her name. He passed their old apartment, now occupied by new tenants. He stood across the street, staring at the building, the place where they once had so little but so much love. His legs gave way and he sat on the sidewalk, head in his hands, whispering her name like a prayer. Edaora. I'm sorry. But she wasn't there. Only the wind answered. Chuka woke up on a thin mattress in a rundown one-room apartment in Mushin, a far cry from the mansion he once called home. The faded curtains hung like neglected memories, and the fan barely turned, its motor wheezing like a tired old man. He had managed to sell off the last of his wristwatches to afford 3 months' rent in this space, which he now shared with cockroaches and the occasional rat. There was no gas cooker, no refrigerator, just a small stove and a bucket he used to bathe each morning. His phone had been long sold. Now he communicated with the world only through visits to cyber cafes or borrowed time on strangers' devices. The silence in this new place wasn't peaceful, it was crushing. And worse than the silence was the shame. The shame of knowing he had it all and lost it, not because life had been unfair, but because he had been foolish, blind, and proud. The fall from grace wasn't just financial, it was deeply emotional. He'd replayed the entire journey in his mind over and over. The startup days, the first funding alert, Edaora's sacrifices, Samantha's curves, the dinners, the seduction, the lies. His mind tormented him with questions that had no answers. How did I get here? Why didn't I listen? Why did I leave her? Each question gnawed at his soul like termites on a wooden frame. He couldn't bear to look in the mirror anymore because every reflection screamed failure. Online he had become the poster child for ruined potential. Videos were made about him, think pieces written on how not to succeed, and memes portraying him as a clown who traded a queen for a vixen. No one cared to ask how he felt. No one saw his tears at night. No one knew that the proud CEO now walked everywhere because he couldn't afford a bus fare. He tried once more to find Edaora. He went to their old church, but she had stopped attending after the divorce. He found an old friend who had once worked with her but was told she had moved, that her business was doing well, and that she was happier now. Chuka didn't blame her. He had done the unforgivable. He had traded true love for lust, loyalty for luxury, peace for pride. He stood at a street corner in Surulere, watching women who looked like her pass by, his heart thudding with false hope every time he thought he saw her. But she was never the one. That night he walked back to his small room and knelt beside his bed. For the first time in years he prayed, not for wealth, not for fame, but for forgiveness. He didn't know if God would listen. He didn't even know if Adaora would ever hear him. But he whispered anyway, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Word had spread like wildfire, as it always does in Lagos. The mighty had fallen. The once celebrated CEO who drove around with escorts and flaunted his curvy wife on social media was now trekking the streets with dust-covered slippers and hollow eyes. People whispered when they saw him. Some laughed. Others clicked their tongues in pity. Bus drivers mocked him. Market women who once hailed him as a fine big man, now called him waste of success. He became the center of ridicule, memes with his face on a beggar's body, captions mocking his rise and fall. He didn't respond. He couldn't. Every insult was just a louder echo of the one in his head. His life had become a public lesson. Don't bite the hand that built you. And as humiliating as it was, Chuka knew he deserved every word. Some days he would walk aimlessly through the city trying to feel something, anything. He'd pass tech hubs where his app was once celebrated. His former office building now displayed a "To Let" banner, and the security guards barely recognized him. He once ran this city, now he couldn't even walk through it with his head held high. He bumped into a former staff member at a bus stop one afternoon, a young woman who used to be on his customer service team. She looked stunned. "Oga Chuka?" she said, half in disbelief. He nodded slowly. She paused, holding back tears. "You were a good boss, before she came." He smiled sadly and nodded again. That was the most genuine interaction he'd had in weeks. As she boarded her bus, she looked back one last time and whispered, "You'll be fine, sir." Those words clung to him like a prayer. He didn't know why, but they gave him enough strength to walk home that night instead of collapsing in a gutter. But for all the humiliation, Chuka learned something powerful in the streets: humility. He began to see people he had once overlooked. The shoemaker who always greeted him with a smile. The beggar boy who cleaned windscreens for coins. The hawker girl who sprinted beside buses to sell gala in traffic. These were real people with real lives. He started helping where he could. Giving a piece of his bread to the hungry. Offering tech advice to young boys at the cyber cafe. And slowly something began to shift inside him. He realized that success wasn't about the mansion, the cars, or the woman with the hourglass shape. Success was peace. It was being able to sleep at night with a clean conscience. He didn't have money anymore, but for the first time in years he had clarity. And with that clarity came a decision: he would try to make things right. Starting with the woman whose love he threw away like it was disposable. It was a Thursday morning when Chuka found the courage to return to the one place that held both his greatest memories and his deepest regrets. The old apartment where he and Adaora had started their journey. The streets were narrower than he remembered. The buildings more faded. But the spirit of the place was the same. He walked past the kiosk where Adaora used to buy beans, past the spot where their neighbor once hung clothes and gossiped about everyone. The nostalgia was overwhelming. He stood outside their former building for nearly half an hour, just watching, as if the past would step out from one of the doors and embrace him. A woman came out of the compound and he asked gently, "Please, do you know where I can find Adaora?" The woman looked at him curiously and replied, "You mean the Accra seller that used to live here? She's doing well now, moved to her own shop and rented a better place. She's a big madam now." Oh. Chuka smiled, bittersweet. She had moved on. Of course she had. Following directions from the woman, he walked to a nearby junction where a small food business had recently gained popularity. As he approached, he saw a clean, neatly branded stall labeled Adaora's Delight. People were gathered around, waiting for fresh akara, mwamwa, and pap. Behind the stall was a woman in a yellow apron and a white headscarf, Adaora. She looked fuller, more radiant, her skin glowing with peace. She laughed as she handed a customer change, wiping sweat from her brow. Chuka stopped several feet away, hidden by a tree, heart pounding. He wanted to run to her, to fall on his knees, to tell her everything. But he couldn't move. He watched as she smiled at her staff, as she served children and joked with elderly women. This was a woman who had rebuilt herself from pain. A woman who had found her own joy. He didn't approach her that day. He couldn't. Instead, he turned around and walked away, wiping his eyes before anyone could see. But something had awakened inside him. He had seen her joy, and it didn't look like something he deserved to interrupt. Not yet. That night he returned to his room and did the only thing he could think of. He wrote a letter. A handwritten one. The same way he used to write her love notes in university. He poured out his heart, his regret, his downfall, his shame, and his apology. He didn't ask for her to take him back. He just wanted her to know he had changed. That he had finally seen the truth. The next morning he returned to her shop early before customers arrived. With trembling hands, he placed the letter on her table and walked away unnoticed. Behind him the sun began to rise, and with it, a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, he could heal. 2 days passed before Adaora saw the letter. It had been left neatly under the tray where she kept her receipts. She almost ignored it, thinking it was a delivery invoice, but something about the handwriting caught her attention. She paused, stared at the familiar curves of the letters, and slowly unfolded the page. Her eyes widened as she began to read. It was Chuka's handwriting. Her heart fluttered, not with love but with confusion, then a quiet dread. She read each line slowly, carefully. His words were raw, full of pain, stripped of pride. He had laid bare the details of his fall. Samantha's betrayal, the company's collapse, the loneliness, the shame. He didn't beg. He didn't make excuses. He simply said, "I am sorry," and told her she didn't have to forgive him, but he hoped she would one day remember the man he used to be before he lost himself. By the time she finished the letter, her hands were trembling. She folded it again, pressed it to her chest, and let the tears come freely. Later that evening, Adaora sat alone in her kitchen, sipping pap in silence. The letter lay on the table beside her. She stared at it for a long time, thinking. Not of his betrayal, not of Samantha's taunting face in those viral wedding photos, but of the boy she met in university. The dreamer who sold his wristwatch to pay her school fees. The man who walked her home every night, even in the rain. She remembered the hunger, the laughter, the dreams. But she also remembered the nights she cried alone, the cold silence of their final months, and the way he didn't even look at her when he handed her the divorce papers. Her heart was torn between the love that still lived in the shadows of her chest and the pain that had built a wall around it. She prayed that night, not for reconciliation but for peace. Peace in knowing that he now understood what she went through. The next morning, just as she was about to open her shop, she saw him. Chuka stood across the road, hands in his pockets, his clothes clean but simple. He looked thinner, humbler. Their eyes met for the first time in over a year. No words. Just a quiet connection that lingered between them like a held breath. Slowly Adaora walked toward him. He bowed his head, unable to hold her gaze. "I got your letter," she said softly. "Thank you." He raised his eyes, watery and full of remorse. "I had to," he whispered. "You deserved more than what I gave." She nodded. "Yes, I did." They stood there in silence, two people with a history too heavy for words. Then she did something that broke him. She reached out and hugged him. Not as a wife, not as a lover, but as someone who still saw his humanity beneath the ruins. He wept in her arms, finally unburdened, finally heard. After their emotional encounter, Adaora returned to her life with quiet reflection. She didn't invite Chuka in, nor did she ask him to stay. But the wall that once stood between them had cracked, and something tender had begun to grow in its place. Chuka didn't push. He came every few days, sometimes helping her carry supplies, other times just sweeping the floor before customers arrived. He never asked for more than her presence. It was enough for him to be near her, to serve in the same space where love had once bloomed. The community took notice, whispers returned, but this time they were gentler. Some pitied him. Others admired his humility. A few mocked him still, but he didn't care. He was no longer chasing validation. He was simply trying to become a man worthy of respect again, whether or not the world ever noticed. Adaora watched him from a distance. She saw how he bent to greet elders, how he gave food to street children, how he stayed behind after closing hours to clean up without being asked. She saw how the pride in his shoulders had given way to grace. She wasn't in love with him again, at least not yet, but she began to forgive him. True forgiveness isn't a thunderclap, it's a quiet surrender. A decision made one memory at a time. Some nights, she'd think of how he used to burn his fingers trying to help her fry akara, how he danced offbeat just to make her laugh. Other nights, she remembered Samantha and the mansion and the public disgrace. But little by little, the good began to outweigh the bad in her heart, and she started smiling again when she saw him. That smile alone gave Chuka the strength to carry on. One afternoon, as they sat under a shade behind the shop eating roasted corn, Adaora turned to him and said, "You've changed." He smiled faintly. Pain will do that to a man. She nodded. But growth too. And I think you're growing, Chuka. Slowly but honestly. He looked at her with eyes full of gratitude. I can't undo the past, he said, but I promise to never disrespect love again. She reached for his hand, not to hold it, but to let it rest briefly in hers. It was the most intimate moment they'd shared in years. No kiss. No grand gesture. Just hands. Just healing. And in that moment, Chuka understood something deeply profound. Sometimes the greatest love stories are not the ones that resume where they left off, but the ones that rebuild from the ground, brick by humble brick. It had been 6 months since Chuka first walked back into Adora's world, and in that time he had become a new man. He no longer thought like a CEO. He thought like a servant, like someone who had tasted both power and poverty, and now understood that character mattered more than charisma. One day, as he helped a group of teenagers fix a faulty computer at the community youth center, the director approached him. You're good at this, the man said. Why don't you come in once a week and teach them? Chuka agreed immediately. It wasn't a job. It didn't pay much. But it gave him purpose. And purpose, he realized, was more nourishing than profit. Soon he was teaching coding basics to young boys and girls, sharing not just skills but his story. I was you once, he'd say. And I made it. Then I lost it. But I'm still here. Word spread quickly. Parents began thanking him. Students brought their friends. The local newspaper did a small feature on his work. It wasn't viral. It wasn't trending. But it was real. Chuka was no longer obsessed with rebuilding an empire. He wanted to rebuild lives, including his own. With Adora's quiet support, he even began consulting for small businesses, helping them digitize their operations. Slowly he earned enough to rent a slightly better apartment. No luxury, just peace. He ate simply, slept well, and for the first time in a long time laughed with ease. At night he would pass by Adora's shop, and sometimes they'd sit under the stars and talk, not about the past but about dreams. She was expanding her menu. He was working on a free tech curriculum for public schools. They had both found their footing, not because they had each other but because they had themselves. One day Adora walked into the youth center unannounced. She watched from the back as Chuka taught a class of teenagers how to build a basic website. His voice was calm, his presence steady. She saw the spark in his eyes, the same spark he once had when he first coded his app in their tiny agigunal flat. When the class ended and he saw her, his face lit up. You came, he said. She smiled. I did. You're doing good work. He nodded, swallowing the emotion in his throat. She stepped closer. Chuka, I may never forget what happened. But I want you to know. I'm proud of who you've become. He lowered his eyes. That means everything to me. In that moment nothing else mattered, not the wealth, the fame, or the fall. What mattered was the man he had become and the woman who, despite it all, still believed in his ability to rise again. Chuka's work at the youth center began attracting attention beyond the community. One afternoon, after finishing a class, he was approached by a man in a smart-looking polo shirt and jeans. The stranger introduced himself as Keen, a former intern at Chuka's tech company from years back. Sir, you might not remember me, but you mentored me during my NYC, he said, a wide smile on his face. Chuka squinted, then chuckled. Keen the genius. Of course I remember. You used to debug our back-end code better than most of my full-time developers. Keen beamed, clearly touched. I owe you a lot. And now I want to repay the favor. I run a growing fintech startup, and we're looking for someone with your experience to advise us. We can't pay much yet, but it's honest work. Chuka's heart swelled. Not at the opportunity, but at the realization that someone still saw value in him. He hesitated before answering. There was a time he wouldn't have looked at such an offer twice. But now, with his new life centered on purpose rather than pride, it felt right. He accepted. The role was remote and part-time, allowing him to continue teaching while guiding the startup's development. In the first month he helped them secure their first investor pitch. In the second he rewrote parts of their core software, increasing performance dramatically. Keen's gratitude was endless. Your humility, sir. It's inspiring, he said one day after a successful demo presentation. Chuka smiled. Life will humble you, Keen. The key is not to fight it but to let it build you. His words weren't rehearsed. They came from the deepest place. Pain, healing, and growth. Adora watched his progress with quiet pride. She never pushed, never demanded labels. Their bond had evolved into something deeper than romance, respect. She saw how he poured himself into others, how he smiled again not because of applause but because of impact. One day she surprised him by enrolling in one of his evening tech classes. "I want to know how all those codes you used to talk about actually work," she teased. Chuka laughed, genuinely delighted. "You already know how to build a business. Tech will just make it bigger." The class was filled with curious eyes, but none as attentive as hers. And that night, after they walked home side by side, Adaora slipped her hand into his without saying a word. He looked at her, eyes soft, heart full. They didn't need to define anything. Love, when reborn from ashes, doesn't need grand declarations. It breathes quietly, steady and strong. Chuka's presence in the startup world began to gain traction again, but this time on a smaller, humbler scale. He wasn't on magazine covers or trending hashtags. He was being referred in closed-door meetings, in whispered recommendations between startup founders who valued substance over flash. "There's this guy," they'd say, "he fell hard but he's brilliant. And different now. You can trust him." That trust became his currency. He was invited to sit on advisory boards, to speak at low-budget tech events, to mentor founders on avoiding the very mistakes he had made. He no longer wore suits. He wore wisdom. His story wasn't a cautionary tale anymore, it was a testimony. He would end his talks with, "Don't let your ego outgrow your foundation. Because when the roof collapses, it's your roots that'll save you." His finances began to recover, slowly but surely. He didn't chase luxury. He focused on stability. He repaid some of his debts, even those no one was asking for anymore. "This is for peace of mind," he told Adaora when she asked why he bothered. She understood. Guilt can linger like an unpaid loan, it had to be cleared for the soul to rest. They continued to grow together. Adaora's food business expanded into catering. Chuka helped her design a mobile app for pre-orders and deliveries. Their nights were often spent in planning, laughter, and the quiet joy of two people who had finally found their rhythm. The past still lingered, but it no longer loomed. It had become a guide, not a ghost. One evening, as they sat on a bench watching children play, Chuka turned to her and said, "I don't know what tomorrow holds, but I'm not afraid of it anymore." Adaora smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Neither am I. Because this time we're walking into it with open eyes." There was a sense of completeness between them, not a perfect fairy tale ending but a deeply rooted peace. They had faced storms, both from the world and within themselves. They had fallen, bled, healed. And now they were rising, not on the back of fame but on the strength of authenticity. Chuka had once thought he needed the world to see his success. Now it was enough that Adaora saw his soul. And in that gaze, he knew he had found everything he had been searching for. Chuka was invited to speak at a major youth empowerment summit in Abuja, a modest yet prestigious platform that focused on real stories, real impact. He was hesitant at first, but Adaora encouraged him. "Your story isn't just yours anymore," she said. "It belongs to everyone who's ever made a mistake and is trying to come back from it." He agreed. When he stepped on that stage, he didn't speak as a tech guru or a former CEO. He spoke as a man who had loved wrongly, chosen foolishly, lost everything, and then found grace again. He told them about Adaora, not as a footnote but as the heart of the story. "She didn't just hold me down," he said. "She lifted me up. And when I broke her heart, she didn't curse me, she walked away with dignity. And when I returned empty and ashamed, she didn't mock me, she reminded me who I used to be." The hall erupted in applause, not because of his eloquence but because of the truth. He didn't glamorize the fall. He didn't villainize Samantha. He simply owned his flaws and honored the woman who had never truly left his side, even in absence. After the talk, journalists approached him, some trying to sensationalize the story. "Will you remarry her? Is she back in your life for good?" He smiled and said, "What matters is that she forgave me. Everything else is a gift." Adaora watched the interview online from her shop, tears glistening in her eyes. It wasn't about the speech. It was about being seen, being honored publicly in a world that had once mocked her silence. That night she called him. "You made me proud today," she said softly. "You always did, Adaora," he replied. "I just didn't know how to show it." The next day he returned to Lagos to find a surprise waiting. Adaora had decorated his small living room with balloons and a simple banner, "Welcome home, partner." On the table was a laptop and a business registration certificate, Roots and Code Tech Hub. A fusion of her food business and his tech dream. "Let's build something together," she said. Chuka, overwhelmed, pulled her into a hug, tears falling freely. "After everything," he whispered. She smiled. "Love isn't just about staying. Sometimes it's about leaving so both people can grow. And when they return, they're better." That night they didn't speak of marriage or titles. They just held hands, two souls who had walked through fire and returned not burned but refined. In each other they saw not just who they used to be, but who they had become. The auditorium was filled with eager faces, most of them young and hungry for knowledge, ambition burning in their eyes. Chuka stood backstage, straightening his shirt, not a designer brand this time, but a clean, simple button-up gifted to him by one of the teenagers he mentored. He held no speech cards, no notes. Everything he needed to say had already been written into his soul by experience. On the large digital screen above the stage, the title of his talk appeared in bold letters, "When the Beauty Fades." He took a deep breath, looked into the mirror one last time and whispered to himself, "This is why you survived." Then he walked out to the podium as the host introduced him, not as the former CEO, not as the disgraced husband, but as a rebuilder of lives and legacies. The audience leaned in as Chuka began. He spoke softly, honestly, with no polish or performance. He told them about how beauty had seduced him, beauty in the form of wealth, status, and the body of a woman who knew how to wield it. He described how he had abandoned character for charisma, depth for curves, love for lust. "I thought beauty was enough," he said. "But beauty fades. And when it does, what's left will either save you or destroy you." The room was silent. The mistake wasn't loving a beautiful woman. The mistake was leaving a woman whose beauty ran deeper than skin, for someone whose beauty stopped at the mirror. He talked about the pain, the fall, the nights he considered ending it all, the shame of watching the world mock his ruin. But then he shared the turning point, not a rescue but a return. Not to riches but to purpose. He ended the talk by speaking of Ada Ora. "She was the kind of beautiful that doesn't fade," he said, voice trembling. "Because it wasn't on her body, it was in her loyalty, in her patience, in the way she loved when there was nothing to gain." He didn't mention that they were back together. He didn't need to. Love like that doesn't need proof. As he walked off the stage, the applause roared, but it didn't fill him like it once would have. What filled him was peace. Ada Ora met him outside the auditorium, standing beneath a tree. She wore a simple dress, hair tied back, face glowing, not from makeup but from joy. "You did well," she said. He smiled, took her hand and kissed it gently. Together they walked into the evening, not as a man and woman chasing what they lost, but as two people holding tightly to what they had found. And in that quiet, ordinary moment, Chuka finally understood. The beauty that fades teaches us the value of the beauty that stays. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment and subscribe to my YouTube channel Tales by Tochi for more.